Welcome back. Let's now talk about our first data structure, and that's going to be arrays. And let's say I wanted to store my friends' names in variables so that I could use them later in my program. And so with the knowledge that we have so far, this is how we would do it. So const friend1, let's say Michael. Let's spell this correct. Then friend2 Stephen, and then friend 3, let's say Peter. Now, this isn't really fun to do, right? Because imagine that we actually wanted to represent 10 friends, and then we would have to create 10 variables. So that doesn't sound like fun. Instead, wouldn't it be great to essentially bundle all of these values together into some bigger container? Well, that's why we have data structures in JavaScript. And arrays are such a data structure. So an array is like a big container into which we can throw variables and then later reference them. And that's super important because programming is most of the time all about data. So we get data from somewhere, we store and process data, and then we give some data back. And that data, it has to go somewhere. So it has to be stored in some place. And for that, we use data structures just like arrays. So in case we have more than just a single value. The two most important data structures, at least in JavaScript, are arrays and objects. And so now let's learn all about arrays. So instead of doing this, let's create a variable which I'm going to call friends. And then we use the brackets to create a new array. And then in there, we can put different values separated by commas. And so let's now use the exact same friends. So Michael, comma, then Stephen, comma, and Peter. And make sure that these commas here are outside of the string. So that's an error I see people do. And so this needs to be one string. So you need to start and finish it, then the comma, and then another value, then another comma, and then another value. Okay, and now let's take a look at it in the console. Okay, and so this is what the array looks like in the console. So basically just as we wrote it in our code. And that is the absolute basics about arrays. So that's how we create one. At least that's the way that we use the most. But there's actually another way. So let me show that to you as well. So let's say we wanted an array of years. And so instead of the brackets, we could also write new array and then parentheses. And in there, we would then specify our values. Let's say 1991, 1984, 2008, and let's say 2020. So an array can hold as many values as we want, and also values of any type that we'd like. So it doesn't have to be strings like here. Of course, numbers work just the same. So here we used a different way of creating the array, which was using this array function. So you see that it's a function because we called it here, basically using these parentheses. And we also needed to use the new keyword, because otherwise it's not going to work. But anyway, it's way more usual to just use the brackets like I did up here, which is called the literal syntax. Great, so now we know how to create arrays, so basically how to put elements into an array, but of course we need to have a way to get them out. And for that we use the square bracket syntax again. So let's say that we want to log to the console the first element of this friends array. So that would be Michael. So console.log, and now we write friends. So that's the name of the array. And then we use the square brackets and then the number 0. That's because arrays are zero-based, which means that this first element is the element number 0, then this one is element number 1, number 2, and so on and so forth. And so if we want the element at position 0, so this first one, then we write friends, square brackets, 0. And that's it. And now let's say we wanted Peter here as well. So that would be element 0, 1, 2. And so let's just write 2. And check it out. And indeed, we get Michael and Peter. Cool. Now, we can also get the actual number of elements that is in the array. So let's also log that one to the console. And this one works by saying friends dot length. Okay? And this dot length is something called a property, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in this section when we talk about objects. Anyway, what matters is that this is going to be the exact amount of elements that is in the array. And it's not zero-based, so it will not be 2, even though the last one here is element number 2. Instead, it really gives us the number of elements in the array. So we should expect this to log 3. And yeah, here we go. Now we can use this to automatically get the last element of any array. And that is useful so that we don't have to count how many elements are in the array. So let me show you how we could do that. Friends, and then remember, to retrieve an element from the array, we need to square brackets. So just like this. And then to get the index of the last element in the array, all we need to do is friends.length minus 1. So friends.length minus 1. And that's because, again, friends.length is not zero-based. So this is 3, remember, but this last element is 2. And so we always need to subtract 1 from this number here. Okay? So what this also means is that inside of these brackets, we can put any expression. It doesn't just have to be a number, literally like we did here and here. So here we have this expression. And remember that an expression is something that produces a value. And so this one here is going to be calculated first. So it will compute friends.length, which is 3, minus 1 is 2, and then it will get friends at position 2. And that's also one of the reasons why it's important that you know what is an expression and what is a statement. Because once again, we could not put a statement in here. So inside of these square brackets, JavaScript expects an expression, not a statement. Anyway, we got the correct element from the array, which is the element number 2. And so that means that this automatic retrieval of the last element works just fine. All right. And moving on, there is more stuff that we can do. So this square brackets syntax that we used here is not only for retrieving elements from the array, but we can also change it to add elements to the array. So let's say that for some reason I'm no longer friends with Peter and that I want to replace him with some other friends. And so now we can change or mutate the array in the same way. So we can say friends at position number 2, and now I'm doing it manually here again. So we can say that this should be equal to something else. Let's say J. And if we now log this friends array to the console, then we should already see the new array. So friends, and let's see. And indeed, the element number 2, so this one here, is now replaced with J. Okay, so in the beginning, when we first logged the friends array to the console, it was still in this state. So it still had Peter. And that's why here in the beginning, we still see that original state. But then as we move on through the code, at some point here, we change that array. And so when we then log the array again, that change is of course reflected here in the output. But wait, didn't I say in the last section that variables declared with const cannot be changed? And we did in fact declare the friends variable here with const, right? But I was still able to change one element of the array here from Peter to J, right? So isn't that a contradiction? Well, what I didn't tell you at the time is that only primitive values are immutable, but an array is not a primitive value. And so we can actually always change it, so we can mutate it. And it works this way because of the way that JavaScript stores things in memory. And once more, we will have a whole lecture just on that topic alone in a special section about how JavaScript works behind the scenes. So what you need to know for now is that we can actually mutate arrays even though they were declared with const. Now what we cannot do is to actually replace the entire array. So we cannot do this. We cannot say that the entire friends array should now be Bob and Alice. That would be illegal. So let's see. And now we get assignment to constant variable. And so that's why that we cannot do. But let's just keep it here anyway, so you get this as a reference. Next up, I want to show you that an array can actually hold values with different types all at the same time. So let's experiment with that. So let's create an array which holds all kinds of information about me. So let's say Jonas, so that would be the first name, then the last name, then the age, and here we can actually calculate the age from other values. And that works because in each position, JavaScript simply expects an expression. And so if we do this, then this is perfectly fine. Okay, so this will here produce a value, and so that's the value that will then be stored at position number 2 of the new array. And that also works for variables. So we could, for example, do first name equal Jonas, and then here instead of literally writing that, we could use this variable name. And so this would then be replaced with the actual string. So let's put some more data. And actually, we could even put other arrays inside of an array. So that's really cool. So let's put the friends array here in the Jonas array. And then with this, we have all the relevant data about Jonas in one handy data structure. And that's really convenient because then we don't have to create one variable for each of the data points. So let's, of course, inspect this now in the console so that you can see that all of these expressions here, basically, so this and this here and this, so all of them are going to be replaced with the values that they produce. And so, indeed, we now get Jonas, we have the calculated age, and here we have the array 3. And we can expand that by clicking on this small triangle here, and then we can see the actual array in here. We also have the length, so length is 5, and so that's where JavaScript gets this friends.length from. Jonas.length would of course also work, and it would be this 5 that we see here. Okay, so that's the one. Great, so these are the very fundamentals of arrays in JavaScript. And now just to finish this video, let's work on a very small array exercise so that we can see why arrays are actually so useful. And to do that, let's bring back our old calc_h function. So it's got to be somewhere here. Yes, let's use this one. We've coded this so many times that I don't want to repeat it. So exercise. So calc_h. And now let's say that we have an array of birth years. And then we want to calculate the ages for some of them. So a new array and let's say 1990, 1967, 2002, 2010, and 2018. And now we will be able to use the calc_age function and then store the results of calculating the ages for some of these years into a new array. So let's see how, and let's see first how we could not do it, okay? So, for example, if we wanted to use the calc_age function for all of the elements in this array, we could not do this. This would be not illegal, I would say, but it's not going to work because this years is an array. And if we pass this years array as an argument to the calc_age function, it doesn't know what to do with it because this operation here expects a single value, and we cannot do a number minus an array. So let me actually show you what's going to happen if we run this. And well, that's not the error that I wanted to show you. So what we get is identifier years has already been declared. So this means that somewhere in the code we already have an array called years. And yeah, here it is. So let's change the name of this one to just y. So that one doesn't really matter anyway. But now let's see what happens. And well, not much did happen. So we actually need to inspect the result of this. So console.log and then the result of this. So let's see. And now we get the result, not a number. And so that's the result of attempting to subtract a whole array, which would be this years array, from a number. Okay, so let's actually do that here as well. Remember that we have access to all the variables that we declare in the script, also in the console. So that's the years array that we just declared. But years, for example, plus 10, does not work. At least not in a way that we expected it. So the plus operator, what it does here is to convert everything to a string, just like I showed you before. And so the string here is then basically this array as a string, and then it adds the 10 here. So that's not meaningful at all. And if we use it with minus 10, then it's even weirder. So we get not a number. So all of this is to say that we cannot really do operations with arrays. But we can still use the calc_age function on individual elements of the array, of course. So let's do that. And we will assume that I want to calculate the ages for the first, the second, and the last array element. So this one, and this one. So let's calculate this and then store the result into a variable called age1. Then we need to get rid of this parenthesis. And so as I said, I want to calculate the age for this first element. And so what we do is to take years at position 0. And so this here will then basically be replaced with 1990. And then calc_age is called with 1990, and the result is stored to age1. Now let's do this some more times. And say age2, age3. And here I'm using 1. So remember, I want this, and the last one. But I don't want to count the number of elements in the array. And so I use that trick that I just showed you in the beginning, which is to first compute the length of the array. So years.length, and then -1 to account for the fact that the index of the array is 0-based. And now we can quickly check out if this actually worked. So age1, age2, age3. And yeah, so we got 3 values here, which are these 3 ages. But we can take this even a little bit further. So since we started with an array, it's usually a good idea to also end up with a new array. So let's create an array, const ages, And now what should I put in here? Well, remember how I said up here that any position of the array simply needs to be an expression, so something that produces a value. And as we already know, this here produces a value as well, right? It is an expression. And so I can take this and simply put it as a position in this array. And so JavaScript will then go ahead, compute this value, and place it in the array. So basically, we can place function calls into an array just fine because they will produce a value. And now here we need to again do years dot length minus 1. And now finally logging it to the console, and then we're done. And indeed, we get the 3 same values that we had up here separately, now all nicely placed into this array. And this of course works because JavaScript will start by running these function calls, these 3 function calls here, and then place all the results in an array afterwards. Nice. And I think that should be enough for one video. I hope that you see how fun arrays can be and how useful they can be. And in the next lecture, we will make them even more useful by doing some operations with them.